So when I told people that I was planning to hike across Normandy with a friend, they thought I was nuts. But when we got to France and we told people what we were actually doing, well, they also thought we were nuts. Why on earth would you do this? Why not a train or a car? Do it on the back of a bicycle. Sure, that all made sense. And considering we were planning to walk on average the equivalent of half a marathon every day for nearly 2 weeks, those other options would have probably been a lot more practical. And in retrospect, there were times on this hike when I was exhausted and ready to lose my mind when I wish I had gone with something else. But here's the thing, I have yet to find anyone who has ever vlogged about this, at least not to this extent. What's more, by hiking, we saw things that we would have otherwise missed. We took back roads that seemed like no one had been on them in weeks. We got a chance to stop at locations that were well off the tour guide handbooks. And it turned out to be one incredibly awesome adventure. If nothing else, we had something we could at least brag about. So with that, I managed to purchase a flight. Lucky for me, there was a direct route from San Francisco to Paris. The travel time, by the way, is the same time as it would take me to get to Tokyo. In Paris, I met up with my good friend Chase, who had arrived the day before and found himself a decent hotel near the Luxembourg Gardens. Now, we have traveled quite a bit in the past. Every couple of years, we make it a point to have a simple guy's trip. Usually it involves some sort of test of manhood. Thus far, we have traversed the Western Sahara on camels, mountain biked the High Atlas in Morocco, partied like rock stars in Dubai, and summited Kilimanjaro. Hiking Normandy kinda sorta just made sense. Paris was exactly like I remembered it. It was a fun, charming, beautiful city, but I have to admit Rome and Madrid are still my favorites. You know, they say that Parisians are rude, but I think that applies to just about any major city. The way I figure, if you don't go out of your way to act like an obnoxious tourist, you'll do all right. For us, we had a really good time that day. We walked in one giant loop about 13 miles from our hotel at the Luxembourg Gardens to the Eiffel Tower and back. Along the way, we hit up a bunch of restaurants, bars, museums, shops, you name it. That said, on September 19th, we got up and we were ready to go. From the hotel, we made our way across the Seine, past the Louvre, and down the Champs-Élysées to the Arc de Triomphe. From there, we had to backtrack a little bit and make our way through the city to get to the train station at Saint-Lazare. I have to admit, this was a beautiful train station. From what I've read, it was built in 1837 as France was beginning to pick up steam in the Industrial Revolution. It's estimated that 250,000 people use this station every day. It's a relatively famous place. The architecture alone is impressive. It's mentioned in a bunch of literature. It's the backdrop to some movies. And in fact, Manet and Monet both lived nearby and painted depictions of it. Now here we were able to not only find our train, but we managed to board it on time, which for me was an achievement considering it had been a really long time since I'd been on a train. We departed Paris and made our way to the northwest. After getting past the suburbs and traveling for a bit, we eventually got into Normandy. I finally got a chance to see just how beautiful this land was. Eventually, after being on the train for over 4 hours, we arrived at our destination, the port city of Cherbourg. During the Second World War, Cherbourg was one of the major objectives of Operation Overlord, that is, the Allied airborne and amphibious assaults on the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. Overlord was a masterstroke of planning. It brought in 160,000 troops with all their equipment, their tanks, their big guns, etc., all in a single day. It involved over 5,000 ships. Now, it's said that amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. It's one thing to bring over a massive army, it's quite another to supply it. Cherbourg was and is a deep-water port. Capturing it would keep the Allied armies viable and supplied. On June 6, 1944, the 4th Infantry Division landed successfully at Utah Beach. It would later be reinforced by the 9th and 79th Infantry Divisions. Together under the command of Major General J. Lawton Collins, commander of the 7th Corps, the American forces would cut across the Cotentin Peninsula, and by June 18th, they had made it to the opposite coast, cutting off the peninsula entirely. The Germans initially were ordered to defend the entire line, especially at strong points like Montberg and Valognes. But eventually they fell back in good order to Cherbourg, which, like many of the German-occupied ports, had been built into a fortress. Now, it should be pointed out that the land that surrounded Cherbourg was also very defensible. As Chase and I were soon to discover, there were a lot of hills, some of them very steep, along with a bunch of forest and woodland areas. The fighting around the city was intense. The Germans had plenty of pillboxes and bunkers. They knew the layout of the land. However, American forces not only had the numbers, but also air support and naval bombardment capabilities. Just as a side note, I actually read that the USS Nevada, one of the ships that came under attack at Pearl Harbor, actually helped in the attack at Cherbourg. That is, before being sent back to the Pacific, where it helped at Iwo Jima, where they took that famous picture of raising the flag on Mount Suribachi. To me, that's just crazy history. If you get a chance, look that one up. By June 20th, 1944, American forces had made it to the outskirts of the city, and by June 22nd, the assault on the city proper began. The urban fighting was horrendous. It was street to street, house to house. One neighborhood at a time had to be taken. By June 26th, Fort Roule, which was one of the central bases of German command in the city, fell. This fort was built into a tall hill near the center of the city. We'll get back to that fort in just a bit. Remember the name. After the fall of Fort Roule, resistance in the city began to fall apart. 3 days later, on June 29th, the German commander, Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, capitulated, but some of his men held out in isolated pockets for a few more days until July 1st. Before the city was taken, however, the Germans had thoroughly demolished the port. It would be essentially unusable until late August. And by that time, ironically, its strategic importance had diminished as Allied armies had moved well to the east. Indeed, by August 19, 1944, Paris was liberated. When we got into Cherbourg, it was raining and overcast, which gave the city a cold appearance. My first impression was that it was kind of grubby, had an industrial vibe to it. Some of the areas were nice, but a lot of the buildings seemed really run down, and perhaps we just didn't get a chance to see some of the better parts of the town. Now, when it comes to planning, which I did for this entire thing a few months ahead of time, I feel like I'm pretty good at it. But for whatever reason, nearly all the accommodations were nearly booked solid. I didn't get my first or second, or even for that matter, third choice of hotels. Instead, we ended up with the Hotel Napoleon, which was located near the statue of Napoleon, which, like the city, seemed to have seen better days. Apparently, Cherbourg was the place that the remains of the French Emperor arrived at in 1840. This is after he died in exile on the island of St. Helena in 1821. Now, have you ever stayed at a hotel where you're just happy you didn't get murdered? That's kind of how I felt about this place. My room smelled like wet dog. The sheets were damp, there were strange stains all over the pillows, and yep, I slept in all of my clothes and my hat that night.
It's cool with the clouds moving in the background.
We woke up the next day and got out of there as fast as we could. Didn't get much sleep at all. We hit up the local bakery for some breakfast and found a coffee shop nearby where all the locals seemed to be gathered at. Coffee and croissant, by the way, with perhaps a bit of cheese, some ham or an egg or something, became my favorite meal in the morning. Simple but perfect. With that, we crossed the inner harbor and made our way to Fort Roule. This place had originally been built in 1793 and had been used as a military base over and over again, which made sense as it was a tall, very steep, imposing hill, which was a perfect defensible location. The Germans had turned this into a major bunker, and there are now tunnels that crisscross the entire hill. In fact, on certain days, they even give tours on what's down there. Hiking to the top of this thing can definitely make you break a sweat, but the views on top are beautiful. You take in just how big of a harbor Cherbourg is. The fort itself is now the Museum of Liberation, which houses a bunch of artifacts, weapons, and diagrams of the Normandy invasion. They even have a wing that's dedicated to how civilians lived under Nazi occupation, along with a set of really interesting German propaganda. My favorite, however, was this mural that they painted near the entrance. I was impressed with the detail and how well the sense of anguish was conveyed. From the museum, we had, well, no other choice but to hike back down the hill, and it's only then that we really began our march across Normandy in earnest. We headed east past the city. Apartment buildings gave way to suburbs, which in turn gave way to the open country. The open country was my favorite. As it had rained, the landscape was a lush green, the rivers and streams were flowing, and we would pass by a bunch of fields that had cows and sheep and horses, which at the time was quaint and novel, but we'd be seeing a lot of that going forward. Our destination that day was the town of Valognes, which, according to Google Maps, was a mere 5 or 6 hour hike, but this felt a lot longer. It seemed like as far as one could see there was nothing but rolling hills, and some of them were quite steep. What's worse, it became quickly evident that my hiking shoes were not up for the challenge. By mile 8 or 9, my feet were killing me. Luckily, we managed to find a couple of places to stop and rest. Now, according to Yelp, there is a restaurant along the way called La Flambe. It was well off the beaten path, but it got amazing ratings, so we decided to stop and get a meal. This place turned out to be excellent. The food was good, but the sense of warmth was even better. This was a mom-and-pop operation, but clearly the whole family basically ran it. Now, we didn't speak much French, and they didn't speak much English, but that didn't seem to matter. We took their suggestions on what to eat and drink, and the experience was, well, memorable. Plus, check this out. They had this painting on the wall that included a white cat, which, being a cat person, was just icing on the cake. From the restaurant, it was another 2 hours of hiking to get to Valognes. Thankfully, it started to get a lot flatter. We used a bunch of smaller, less traveled roads to get into the town as soon as we could. We arrived just as the sun was setting. According to my phone, we had hiked nearly 19 miles, though I admit this could have been an overread. However, I could still feel it in my legs. This was one of the hardest days we had. The hills alone were draining, and I'll be honest, I was really beginning to second-guess my choice of hiking this thing. Our hotel, which was called the Ox Hotel, was located close to the center of town near the cathedral. It was perfect, comfortable, clean, it came with breakfast. I had to lay in bed for about an hour before I could feel my feet again, but then it was time to explore. As it would turn out, Valognes would be one of the most awesome, beautiful, quaint towns I had ever been to anywhere in my life. But I don't want to cut my experience there short, so I'll leave that for part 2.